Hi, and welcome to InFocus. This is Jabbar Al-Obaidi. With me through Zoom, Emeritus Professor of Political Science, Dr. Shaheen Mozaffar from Bridgewater State University. In this episode, we'll be talking about 2020 elections. Dr. Mozaffar, welcome to InFocus. And I just would like to ask you to start with, how do you distinguish or compare between 2016 and 2020 election?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jabbar, for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. As you can imagine, this is by all yardstick is a very important election. And I think your question that you asked, how to compare this election, that's a place I would like to begin. So if we take a look at the Electoral College results, Mr. Trump won quite a few states he was not expected to win, especially the 8 to 10 battleground states. And these battleground states will become important in the election, both in the 2018 election. And so what I would like to do is to just do some quick comparison. Okay. One of the things you will see is the blue states, where you see all the Democrats winning quite substantially. And what is important to understand about those 2018 midterm House elections, that this is one of the few times in recent history that the Democrats made deep inroads in what is normally considered to be red states. We can expect them to win in the Northeast, but if you take a look at the Midwest, and particularly the Southwest and the Florida area. And I think we need to keep that in mind, because I think we will see that repeated in this current election. But what is also important to understand is that the 2018 off-year congressional election produced one of the most dramatic demographic changes in the House. The last time the Congress, especially the House of Representatives, witnessed this kind of change, it occurred in the 1974 elections. So I have some data, and you will see that the percentage of change across all demographics, male, female, non-Hispanic whites, African Americans, Asian, Native Americans, openly LGBTQ, all of these demographics increase their representation in the House of Representatives. But what is also important is that what we are witnessing is the beginning of a major generational shift in American representation and American politics. And I will come back to that, because that is something we don't normally talk about a little bit. And that's what we are witnessing. The challenge is how to go about understanding that. And perhaps we can talk about, I like to use what I call my iceberg model of American politics. But before we do that, I want to mention one more thing, that if you take up some of the recent polling, and there is a map there, I think I put it up, where you talk about 10 states. These are the battleground states. These are for the 2020 elections. And you can see the problem Mr. Trump is facing. In all of these states, if you take a look on the right-hand side, Mr. Trump won all of these states by a margin of no more than 10%. In Michigan, for example, he won by less than 1%. So I thought I would share this information to show where Mr. Trump has problems, because he's an incumbent. And if you take a look at all these are counties in what is conventionally be considered to be the red states. Mr. Trump should be leading because he's an incumbent. But what is happening here is that you see Mr. Biden is up in virtually all of them, and the rest of the states are toss-up states. The only county where Mr. Trump is leading is in Vigo County, which is in the southwest part of Indiana, in Terre Haute. and he won that state by 19%. So if you just take a look at this map, this data, by the way, just came out early this month, in October. This alone, I think, exemplifies the severe problem Mr. Trump is facing, and that has led to a lot of his old constituencies deserting him. And we can talk about why are they doing that. So that's the connection between what we have seen between the 2016 election, the 2018 off-year elections, and what we are likely to see now.
So, you have almost 2 weeks
Right,
before the election.
right.
What are the things that you think should be changed on either sides in order to secure a winning?
That's a very important question, and there's a number of reasons we should talk about. But let me start with the data that I just collected 10 minutes ago, so I don't have it to show you. We are witnessing somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million people have already voted. Let me tell you how dramatic this is. This is 71% more people voting in early voting than 2016. This is quite dramatic. And 30 million people, meaning 25% of all the people who voted in 2016 have already voted. Now, so the chances are very good that not much is going to be changed with the numbers that we are witnessing. And we already have polling data to show that people have already made up their minds.
I see the first slide in 2016 Electoral College results
Right,
and the 2018 midterm House election results.
right.
And then you go to the
Demographics, right.
Yeah.
But
So
before
how can you, Dr. Mozaffar, can you make the connection between these three slides, because they have a lot worth of information there?
Right. Let me just step back a little bit.
Yes.
I think I put up a slide called my iceberg model. So one of the things I like to think about
Yes.
is that if you think about an iceberg, the election is at the top, and below the water line, there are a number of things that is happening.
Yes.
And in the short run, what is driving the election clearly are COVID, the economic slowdown, and racial justice. We have seen some quite dramatic, when you put these three things together, we have seen mobilization like we have not seen in a long time in American history. And that's what driving this election. So we all know that, and I don't want to spend that much time, but those things, if you combine those three things, those are not very good news for Mr. Trump. 8 million infected, 220,000 people dead, 8% unemployment, 30 million unemployed. This is a nightmare for any incumbent when you combine these three. And then you add the multiracial coalition for the first time we are seeing in about 20, 25 years in the United States. So when you add these things up, that's what driving in the short run. But what is driving in the long run and the medium run is the two things that you had mentioned. And so let me talk about it. It's called negative partisanship. So let me spend a few minutes what we have seen over the last 25, 30 years. What we have witnessed in American presidential election is a concept called negative partisanship. So what does that mean? In order to understand negative partisanship, we need to understand what positive partisanship is.
Correct.
Positive partisanship is that when I vote for party candidate A, I like the candidate and I'm going to vote for that candidate. It's like a positive partisanship, and I like candidate B, I will vote for candidate B. I like both of them, then I have to make a choice between A and B, but I'm voting for a candidate. What we have witnessed in the last 20, 25 years, and we have now a lot of data, we have the rise in the American electoral politics of negative partisanship. And what negative partisanship means is that I'm not voting for a candidate, I'm voting against a candidate. And increasingly, people are beginning to do that. And this was what happened with Mrs. Clinton in 2016. In the last couple of weeks of the election, last 2 or 3 weeks of the election, a lot of the independents who sat on the sidelines did not like Mrs. Clinton more than they like Mr. Trump. And so the net result was they were voting for Mrs. Clinton against Mrs. Clinton, and not necessarily for Mr. Trump. One of the things that has happened as a result of this, that people already make up their minds. who they're going to vote against, not necessarily who they're going to vote for. And what we are also witnessing in some new phenomenon in American politics. We all talk about independence. So let me say a few things about independence.
Please.
Our conventional wisdom is, our conventional standard stereotype wisdom is independents don't have party affiliation and they make up their own minds. Survey data show that doesn't work that way. Independents are quite ignorant about politics. That's why they're independents. And they don't oftentimes, they're alienated, they're not interested. They make up their mind impulsively at the last minute. And we have seen this kind of volatility among independents. That's why people talk about going for the independents. And so the reason why they're independent is because they don't have any political affiliation. They don't, first of all, they don't know much about politics. And
so, could you qualify those independents? Are they college graduate? Are they?
They're mostly younger people. They're mostly younger people in the 20s and 30s. And younger people don't vote as much anyway. College graduates have the lowest voter turnout since 1972 when 18-year-old got the vote. So independents, so I want to raise that issue because there's a lot of misconception about what independents are. But what we are also looking at, because of negative partisanship, independents already, when they do vote, they vote for one party or the other. So in some ways, they're really not independents. And particularly in the last two elections, this election particularly, the independents have basically made up their minds. And there are not that many independents left to go mobilize them for either party. The challenge for either party is to get their supporters out as much as possible. What we're also witnessing, and this is quite a new phenomenon in American politics. In the old days, there was something called split ticket voting, where voters will vote for presidents of one party, and they will vote for Congress for another party. Because presidential elections usually are a short-term phenomenon. And the whole saying was voters hate the Congress, but love their congressman.
Yeah.
And for a long time, they kept voting for the same congressmen, for the same people in Congress and Senate, but they kept changing their votes at the presidential level. And that is what is known as split ticket voting. The number of split ticket voting has gone down dramatically. And that is because of negative partisanship. So if you don't like Mr. Trump, you are not only going to vote against Mr. Trump, you're going to vote against every single Republican. And if you don't like Democrats, you're not only going to vote against Mr. Biden, but you're also going to vote against every single Democrats. And all of this in this election, from what the data we have seen so far, is not working very well for Mr. Trump. And what we're also witnessing, it is a process known as nationalization of elections. And what that means, and I'll tell you, for example, the Republican candidates in Arizona, in Colorado, in Georgia, in Iowa, in Montana, in North Carolina, Texas, most of them are red states. And there is good possibility that at least 4 or 5 of them, the Republican candidates will lose. In Arizona, they're just about to lose. Colorado, they will lose. Of all places, they might lose in Georgia. Of all places, they might, in fact, just day before yesterday, some of the pollsters shifted Iowa towards Democratic candidate against Joni Ernst. So what we're witnessing now is that negative partisanship is working in a way that people are coming out in huge numbers, even those people who don't particularly like Mr. Biden. They're coming out in huge numbers because they do not like Mr. Trump and the Republican Party. And that's a very, very important phenomenon we are witnessing. And to what extent this will drive American politics remains to be seen.
Now the negative participation. Does this have anything, let's say, with minorities, with race, with?
The answer to your question is yes and no, and that's, I think, is a very important point. And that gets us to the demographics that I was talking about. Let me just mention as a background that underlying American politics. American electoral politics is relatively stable. That if you take a look at 70, especially 70, 80, 100 years, American electoral politics does not change that much. Only short-term phenomenon like the Vietnam War, for example, the civil rights movements, for example, women's rights movements, for example. Those have an impact, but they have a short-term impact. But what is happening in the last 30, 40 years, the basic foundation of American politics has begun to change. So not only are the rules remain intact, the game has changed. And the three things that are driving that are demographic change, income inequality, and globalization. So what I would like to do, if you want me to discuss, I'll be happy to talk about the demographic change.
Please do. Please
Yes.
do. Yeah.
I don't normally like to be, because my training, I don't like to be rather dramatic in my comments, but demographic data is telling us that United States is undergoing a massive demographic transition that no country in the world is going. There's only one country which is going through this. And what that means is that the majority population is becoming a minority population. And this surprised a lot of people. The only other country which is going through that is Israel. And United States is undergoing that trend. And that has a tremendous implications, particularly in the Midwest, where I grew up in Ohio. So if you visualize a map of the United States, say from Western Pennsylvania, through Ohio, through Indiana, through Illinois, through Michigan, Wisconsin, this is the industrial heartland of America. And Mr. Trump is wrong. America was already great. And what made America great was this 5, 6, 7 in the heartland of America. This is the powerhouse of American economic prosperity, American economic growth. That has come to a stop. It is like as if the middle part of the country has simply dropped out. And there's a very good book out by an economist called Men Not Working. And most of these men are working class, middle class, white. They're angry, and that's why they voted for Mr. Trump. And so that, and one of the reasons what's also happening is that, and this is particularly true of the Republican Party, they've begun to realize that the demographic is not working for them. So what I'd like to do, if you take a look at one of the table I put up called the Changing Ethnic and Racial Composition of American Voters.
Yes.
So if you now take a look from 2000 to 2018, percentage of whites, and I'm going to simply use this classification, and I'll come back and explain that. I don't think they're particularly helpful to understand the depths of American politics. But for now, it is a very useful metric. So if you take a look at the percentage of white who are American electorates, they have dropped from 76% in 2000 to 67%. The most dramatic increase has been with Hispanics. They have doubled the size of the electorate.
From 7% to 13%.
Yes, as are blacks, have the Asians, and all the others together. And what I also did for you, for the audience, is to create a graph. If you take a look at the graphs I put together,
yes,
where the whites are in the top and the other groups are in the bottom. But if you take the whites away and go to the next graph, where you leave aside the white, you can see the dramatic increase in the black electorate, in the size of the black electorate, size of the Hispanic electorate, and size of the Asian electorate, and size of the other racial ethnic minorities. United States, the last time United States actually witnessed this kind of demographic change was possibly around the turn of the early part of the 20th century, when you had the first wave of immigration into the United States. And what is ironic about that wave led to the electoral loss of the Republican Party. The irony of all of this is that, and there I'm going to start qualifying what I have said. And there's a lot of data, but there's a lot of misinterpretation in the press as well.
How so?
Well, this is what I'm going to explain. We normally think of immigrants, particularly non-European immigrants, And we think of them incorrectly, I would say, that they are socially progressives. Because remember, they don't come from cultures that are progressive cultures. And I'll use Hispanics, for example. The Hispanic, remember, most Hispanics don't do be Catholics, right? Which means they're anti-gay, anti-abortion, right? And so after Mitt Romney lost the election, the Republican Party had a major paper submitted a research paper in which they said they're going to mobilize the Hispanics. And they started off quite nicely doing that, except the Republican Party got taken over by the right-wing extremists. And so the net result is Hispanics are voting for the Democratic Party for political reasons, not for social reasons. And you can also see this in the Hispanic population in the Southwest. Particularly, there is a small but critical mass of Hispanic, particularly Mexican Americans, who Mr. Trump. And you go to Southern Florida, the Cuban Americans who vote in large numbers for the Republican Party. So on socially, culturally grounds, many of these immigrant groups, and this is across the board, whether they're talking about South Asians, whether they're talking about Arab Americans. And let me give you one more, what the data I like to point out. Of all the immigrant groups in the United States, one immigrant group has made the largest amount of electoral contribution to election campaign contribution, and that happens to be the Arabs. Arab Americans actually contribute a large percentage of campaign contributions to the Republican Party. And we know that because all you have to do is to go to the Federal Election Commission, and they actually superimpose an amount of campaign contribution over the zip codes. And guess where the per capita largest zip code is? It's in Dearborn, Michigan, which has the single largest population of Arabs. Arabs are also very conservative. In fact, I was just reading a book called The Fundamentalist Churches Who Have Voted for Trump. And the author does an excellent job of researching 10 churches. One of them is in Houston, and it is an extremely conservative, fundamentalist Christian church. It is 100% Arab. See, Americans, we oftentimes don't understand that. And the point of this story is that we need to be cautious about how we portray the immigrant population as some kind of what I call a homogeneous, monolithic blob of people. They're not. So I will stop there for a second, and then we can have
we have almost 5 minutes left. So tell me, when you say they are voting not for social reasons, it's for political reasons.
Yeah.
Does this mean? Actually, let me rephrase it. Are they actually registered Republicans or Democrats, or just people they go vote because this is their right, but they don't necessarily are affiliated with a particular party?
Let me tell you who has the highest voter turnout rates. First generation immigrants. Most immigrants, when they become citizens, the first thing they do, they go and register to vote. And in the 2 election cycle, immigrant population vote in proportionately large number than American population.
Yes.
Until the 3rd or 4th election cycle, then they go back to normal. And lately, they have all been registering Democrat, in large part because of all the immigration policy and the border policy that Mr. Trump has launched. But we need to be careful because they can be mobilized by the Republican Party if the Republican Party can overcome what I call its image of being a white racist male-dominated party. And I think they will have simply on social grounds, simply on social values, family values. Many of the immigrants are likely to support them. I'm not so sure they're likely to support them on political grounds, which is where I think the Democrats have an advantage so far, at least.
So now, you have a nice slide there about voting and public policy. And so what's the combination between Congress, public policy, president, and voting,
I'm
and
glad you
all
mentioned.
the
Yeah,
things that you mentioned?
I'm glad you mentioned that. I will preface my explanation that you asked for by saying, and this is going to make my progressive colleagues very angry. I think progressives need to be more pragmatic about what they are likely to get under the Biden administration. They will be quite disappointed. Now, why am I saying that? I'm saying that because the American government is not designed to move rapidly. It is designed, it's like a cumbersome system designed to make haste slowly. And the way I try to explain that is the relationship between voting and public policy. If you take a look at that graph, you will see there is no direct line between voting and public policy. Public policy is passed not because of voting, it is passed through negotiation between Congress and the president. And what happens in that process of negotiation, things that are promised during voting gets diluted. And so I think you have heard me say this. My punchline is that if you are expecting the American government, the system of government we have, to produce results that are morally, culturally, ideologically desirable, you will go to your grave a very miserable human being. What you should be looking for is to look for policies that are feasible. Let me give you a couple of very quick examples from our own history. Take, for example, two of the most socially progressive policies of the 20th century, Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, right? Completely transform American politics. We should not forget that both those bills were pushed by Lyndon Johnson, who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan in his younger days in Texas. And so because he learned that this is the way to win the election, this is the way the country is changing, right? To his credit. And so my point is, and in fact, as you know, I've done a lot of this kind of work, and I have a lot of fancy graphs to show that we need to lower our expectation to what is feasible. And what is likely to come out will not look much like what happens in election time.
Okay.
And the reason to understand that is that what happens in the middle, think of it as a one game. Voting is one game, and public policy is another game. That's the way the system is set up, and the person we can all thank, this person who is my hero, is James Madison.
So, Professor Mozaffar, what's your prediction?
I knew you. I was afraid you're going to ask that. I think all of us has become gun shy given what happened in 2016. But if we then take a look at the demographic changes, take a look at what has happened with COVID that I've just outlined, COVID, racial justice, economic decline, and negative partisanship. If you put all of this together in the mix, every data, every polling that we are witnessing looks very good for Mr. Biden. And the challenge for Mr. Biden and the Democrats is not only to win the presidency, the challenge is to regain the control of the Senate. That's where the challenge is. And I think, again, I'm sticking my neck out, but given all indications are, it looks pretty good, at least now 2 weeks out. And like I said, things have become basically baked, and people are not going to change their minds. So that's where we are today.
Professor Shaheen Mozaffar, this is very fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time and actually collecting all this data. And I know, please come back so we can talk about after November 3rd.
I will be happy to do that. I'm always at your disposal. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for watching InFocus, and we'll see you next week.